All right, so we're diving deep today into Luke 21, 1-4. And you know this story. It's the one with the widow's offering. But we're not just skimming the surface here. We're going to look at how different pastors have approached this passage, how they've made it into these compelling sermons. Hopefully, we can spark some ideas for your own teaching and preaching.
Yeah, it's interesting how many pastors went beyond just praising her sacrifice. They really dug into what's going on beneath the surface of this story. For example, Menlo Church had this sermon called Commitment Weekend, Generosity, Faith, and Hope for Everyone. And they kind of flipped the script. They said the real takeaway isn't about the amount she gave, but the fact that she gave everything.
Yeah, that's a huge shift in perspective, isn't it? It makes you
Yeah.
think about what real radical generosity actually looks like. Like, is it about giving a certain percentage? Or is it about completely surrendering what you hold dear?
Exactly. And this idea of proportional giving, Abundance Springs Community Church really tackled that head on. They use this example of Warren Buffett. He gives these huge amounts to charity, but it's still a pretty small part of what he actually has. So they asked this really thought-provoking question. What does proportional giving look like for someone with just a normal income, someone who's not a billionaire? How do we teach that concept effectively?
It's such a good way to make this ancient story connect with people today. And it's not even just about the numbers, right? A lot of the sermons I saw emphasized the heart behind the giving. They contrasted the widow's genuine generosity with the wealthy people who seem to be giving out of obligation
Yeah.
or just wanting to be seen.
Oh, definitely. First Alliance Church Toledo went as far as saying the widow's offering was an act of worship. They compared it to the way the wealthy would give back then. They would drop their coins super loudly into these bronze boxes in the temple, almost to draw attention to themselves.
Wow. So it's like
Yeah.
it becomes a totally different thing. It's not
Well,
just this simple act of charity. It's about humility
yeah.
and real devotion.
Exactly. They said true giving should be joyful and voluntary. Like it says in 2 Corinthians 9:7, God loves a cheerful giver. It makes you wonder, were those showy givers actually happy when they were giving, or were they just trying to make themselves look good?
So we've got this contrast between what people see and what's actually going on inside. But how did these pastors bring these ideas to life for their congregations?
Well, one thing that stood out to me was how they used illustrations. One pastor told this really vivid story about a businessman and a missionary who saw this young boy pulling a plow in a developing country, and the boy, even though they were surrounded by poverty, had this incredible joy about him.
That's powerful. It shows that real generosity isn't about how much money you have. It's about your attitude.
And another pastor used this analogy of a leaky faucet on the Titanic. Imagine worrying about that tiny leak
Yeah.
while the whole ship is sinking around you. It's like focusing on the little amount the widow gave. Instead of her amazing act of faith, even though she was in a tough spot herself.
I love those kinds of analogies. They help people really grasp something like sacrificial giving and make it real and relatable. But did any of the sermons talk about the historical context of this story? Because, understanding what life was like back then could really add a lot to our understanding.
You're absolutely right. Destiny Church did a great job explaining how tough it was for widows in those times. They were often left with absolutely nothing, and people looked down on them. Knowing all that makes what the widow did even more radical.
It's like she's facing all this hardship and choosing to trust God over fear.
Exactly. And it reminds us that this story isn't just some nice tale from the past. It's a challenge to think about what really matters to us and ask ourselves, are we willing to trust God even when it feels like we have nothing left?
This reminds me of something else I found interesting. Crossroads Church connected this passage to the work of Mark Batterson. He's written a lot about generosity. They even said that his teachings could be helpful for people who want to explore this idea further.
Oh yeah, that's a great resource. It's like a bonus deep dive within our deep dive. But what really struck you as particularly insightful?
You know, I was fascinated by how many sermons focused on the Greek word Ptōchos. That's the word used to describe the widow's poverty. It's not just about being poor. It's like this picture of extreme need.
You're right. It suggests a level of need that most of us can't even imagine, and it changes the whole story. It's not just that she gave her last 2 coins. It's that those were literally all she had left in the world.
It's a serious reality check. It's
Yeah.
not even giving until it hurts. It's giving until there's nothing left. And it makes you wonder, what are we holding on to that might be keeping us from experiencing God's abundance?
Yeah, it's a question that can be uncomfortable, But it can also lead to some serious spiritual growth. And a lot of other sermons talked about this focus on interchange.
Oh, really? Like how?
Well, SCN Live shared a pretty interesting modern example. They talked about this professional athlete who had a multi-million-dollar contract, but was still struggling financially. It just shows that even people who seem to have it all can still struggle with generosity and being responsible with what they have.
That's a great illustration.
It shows that true wealth isn't about how much money you've got. It's about the state of your heart.
Exactly.
And it circles back to the widow's offering. She might not have had much materially, but her spiritual wealth was immeasurable. It's a powerful contrast. It makes us question our own definitions of success and abundance.
It really does make you think about the messages we send to our congregations. Are we emphasizing spiritual wealth as much as material wealth?
That's a huge question for any pastor or teacher to think about. And it's not just about what we say, but also how we live our own lives. Are we modeling that radical generosity and trust in God that we're asking others to embrace?
That's a great point, and I think that leads into something else that stood out to me in these sermons. The connection between the widow's offering and servant leadership. Shelby Christian and Missionary Alliance, in their sermon, Heartfelt Generosity, True Giving and Servant Leadership, made a really interesting argument there.
Oh, yeah. They said that true leadership, just like the widow's giving, is all about sacrificing and putting the needs of others before your own.
Yeah, it really challenges that traditional image of a leader, doesn't it? It's not about being the one in charge and giving orders. It's about leading by example, just like the widow did.
And they didn't stop there. They even brought in 2 Corinthians 8:1-5 to back it up. That passage talks about how the Macedonian churches gave so generously, even though they were struggling themselves. It's a powerful reminder that true generosity goes beyond our circumstances.
It really is. It makes you wonder what kind of impact we could have if we all approached leadership with that same selflessness. But let's shift gears a bit. I think it's important to talk about how we can actually apply all of this. It's easy to get inspired by the widow's story, but how do we actually cultivate that same spirit of generosity in ourselves and in the people we teach?
That's where those creative sermon illustrations come in. Remember that pastor who used the analogy of the leaky faucet on the Titanic? It's such a simple image, but it helps people grasp a complex idea like sacrificial giving.
Absolutely. And it's not just about finding a catchy analogy. It's about creating that connection between the head and the heart. It's about helping people feel the truth of the message, not just understand it intellectually.
Yeah, you're right. That's why stories and personal anecdotes can be so powerful. They create an emotional resonance that really sticks with people, more than just stating facts or principles.
And that's what made some of these sermons so effective. They didn't shy away from the weight of the widow's story. They didn't try to make her poverty sound better than it was, or downplay her sacrifice.
Absolutely. They acknowledged how difficult her situation was. And by doing that, they made her faith even more remarkable.
It's about recognizing that tension between our human desire for comfort and security and our spiritual calling to live a life of radical generosity.
And to bring back something we talked about earlier, First Alliance Church Toledo did a great job weaving together those emotional, practical, and theological aspects. They brought up John Piper's definition of worship as reflecting God's worth.
I love that definition.
Yeah.
So when we give generously, we're reflecting God's generosity back to him.
Exactly. And they contrasted this with the kind of giving that's just for show or to get recognition, highlighting that difference between genuine worship and empty ritual.
That's so important, especially with social media today,
Yeah.
where it's so easy to show off your generosity.
It's a real challenge to keep our motives pure and make sure that our giving comes from a genuine place, a desire to honor God and help others. And remember, it doesn't always have to be about money. It can be about giving our time, our talents, our listening ears, or even just a kind word.
That's a great point. It's about broadening our understanding of what it means to be generous.
Exactly. And I think that's a key takeaway from this whole deep dive. Luke 21:1-4 isn't just a nice story about a poor widow. It's a challenge to look at our own hearts, our motivations, and what it means to live a life of true generosity.
And it's a reminder that this isn't a one-time thing. It's an ongoing attitude. It's about living a life where generosity flows naturally from our love for God and wanting to see his kingdom come.
I love that. And that brings us back to the challenge of teaching this effectively. It's not about making people feel guilty into giving. It's about inspiring them to give from a heart that's full of gratitude and love for God.
Yeah, it really is. It's about recognizing that we're all on this journey together and that we need each other's support. You know, speaking of support, Menlo Church made a really interesting point in their sermon. They talked about how even the smallest act of generosity can have a much bigger impact than we realize. They use this analogy of a pebble being tossed into a pond.
Oh, that's a great visual. Like you drop that tiny pebble in and it creates those ripples that spread out across the whole pond.
Exactly, and they applied that to the widow's offering, suggesting that even though her gift seemed small, it could have had a ripple effect that we can't even imagine.
Yeah, it's a beautiful way to think about those little acts of kindness. It reminds us that we never know how our actions might impact other people.
It makes you realize that there's no such thing as an insignificant act of generosity. Every gift, every kind word, every act of service can make a difference.
And that can be really encouraging, especially for people who feel like they don't have much to offer. It reminds us that generosity isn't about the amount we give, it's about the heart behind it.
It's about recognizing that we all have something to give, no matter what our situation is. You know what really struck me about all these sermons is how they took this ancient story and made it feel so relevant to our lives today. They didn't shy away from talking about modern issues like poverty and inequality.
Right. It's like they built a bridge between the biblical world and our world, showing that these principles of generosity are just as important today as they were back then.
Exactly. They weren't afraid to challenge their congregations to think about their own lifestyles and how they view money.
And that's something we need more of, pastors and teachers who are willing to challenge the status quo and call people to live differently.
It's about more than just preaching feel-good sermons. It's about helping people live out their faith in real and practical ways.
You know, one sermon that really did that was from First Alliance Church Toledo. They didn't just talk about the widow's offering, they connected it to God's own generosity.
Right. They reminded people that God is the ultimate giver and that we're supposed to reflect that in our own lives.
They talked about how everything we have is a gift from God and that we're called to be good stewards of those gifts.
It's about understanding that generosity isn't about emptying ourselves. It's about being part of a cycle of abundance where we give freely and trust that God will provide.
And that trust is what allows us to experience true freedom and joy in our giving.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's one key takeaway that you hope our listeners will take with them?
I think the most important thing to remember is that Luke 21, 1-4, isn't just a story about a poor widow. It's a story about what happens when we're radically generous. It's a story that challenges us to look at our own hearts, our priorities, and our relationship with God.
It's a story that invites us to trust God with everything we have and to experience the joy of giving freely.
And it's a story that shows us that even the smallest act of kindness can have a huge impact.
So let's go out there and be those ripples of generosity making a difference in our communities and in the world.